My name is Petra, and the night I brought my son home from the hospital, my mother-in-law stood in my living room, looked at the baby in my arms, and said, with absolute certainty, "He doesn't look like one of ours." Not congratulations. Not he's beautiful. Not welcome to the family. Or he has your eyes. Or I'm so glad you're both okay. She looked at my 3-hour-old child. The baby I had just spent 31 hours delivering. The baby who had been in the world for less time than a long workday. The baby who was still wearing the little hospital hat they'd put on him in the delivery room. And she said he didn't look like one of theirs. I was sitting in our living room, on the couch, with a pillow under my arm and the baby against my chest, still wearing the hospital bracelet, still in the fog of someone who has not slept and has just done one of the hardest physical things a body can do, and I looked up at her and I did not say what I was thinking. Which was, he is 3 hours old, look at yourself, what are you doing? I smiled. Because I was too tired and too happy and too new to this to understand yet what that sentence meant, and what it was going to cost me. My husband, Marcus, no. I need a different name for him. My husband Eli laughed it off, the way he always laughed off his mother. Mom, he's a newborn, they all look the same, and Harriet smiled thinly and said, "Our babies never looked like that," and turned to go put the kettle on. And that was the beginning of the end of a great many things. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I am going to tell you about a DNA test in this story. But this is not a story where the DNA test wins anything. The test was a trap that became a key, and the door it opened was not the one Harriet intended. She set it up to expose me. What it actually exposed was her, and not in the way any of us expected. And not because the test result jumped up and announced her secret on its own. It did not march into a courtroom and vindicate me. It did not shame Harriet in front of the family. The result came back. It told me what I already knew about my own son, and then it said one strange, quiet thing that sent me looking in a direction Harriet had never imagined I would look. And when I looked, what I found was a secret 30 years old, buried under everything she had built. The very thing her whole campaign against me had been, without her knowing it, protecting. I had to find that myself, by going looking. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this actually started. Welcome to Composed Drama Stories, where the women everyone underestimated finally tell their side. If quiet strength and slow justice are your kind of evening, stay with me. Eli and I met when we were both 26. At a professional development conference, I'm a pediatric occupational therapist. I work with children who have developmental delays and sensory differences, and Eli is a structural engineer, and we ended up at the same terrible breakout session about leadership synergies or some such thing, and we spent the entire hour passing notes like middle schoolers, making fun of the speaker's slides. And by the end of it, I was completely in love with him. We dated for 2 years, got married quietly with close friends at a vineyard outside Portland, and spent 3 more years building a life I was genuinely proud of: a house, good work, a dog named Biscuit, each other. I was happy. I thought we were solid. Harriet was the asterisk. She lived 40 minutes away, in the house where Eli and his older sister Joanna had grown up. And from the very first time I met her, I understood that she was the kind of woman who had a very specific picture of what her son's life should look like. And I was not it. Not because I was bad, particularly just because I wasn't what she'd imagined. I wasn't from the Pacific Northwest. I wasn't from the same social circle. I wasn't from the same background. I had a demanding career that I was unwilling to subordinate to family logistics. And perhaps most importantly, I had opinions, and I was willing to voice them. And Harriet had raised a son who was peaceable and agreeable, and who had spent his whole life letting his mother set the tone. And I was an obstacle to that dynamic in a way she found deeply inconvenient. She never said any of this outright, of course. Harriet didn't do outright. She did the long, slow work of accumulated implication, the slightly too bright smile when I talked about my caseload. The gentle wondering whether I'd considered what it might mean for children if their mother worked such long hours. The casual references to women she admired who had prioritized differently. There was the comment at Thanksgiving in our second year of marriage about how she'd always believed a woman's career was a wonderful thing. Up to a point said with a warm smile, at the table, with Eli right there. In a way that made objecting seem like a personal attack on her. There were the questions about my family, my upbringing, the part of the country I was from, delivered with gentle curiosity, but a persistent undertone that suggested she was assembling a file, noting the ways I didn't fit the template. There was the way she referred to our traditions and the way we do things in conversations that included me, but in which the we very clearly did not. She never attacked. She just carved, steadily, at the edges of my confidence, and did it in a way that was always deniable, always wrapped in a tone of sweetest concern, always delivered while Eli was in the next room or refilling drinks, just out of earshot. She was a precise and patient woman, Harriet, and she had decades of practice. And the thing about that kind of patient, deniable carving is that it works on you even when you see it happening. I knew what she was doing. I still felt it. Knowing the name of a wound does not make the wound stop hurting. Eli saw some of it. Not enough. He'd grown up inside her patterns, which meant he was partly blind to them the way you can't smell the air of the house you've always lived in. When I'd try to describe it, he'd get a slightly pained expression and say something like, "She means well, she just has a particular way," and I'd want to flip the kitchen table. But I didn't. Because I loved him. And I knew that whatever Harriet was, she was also his mother. And that untangling that particular knot would take years. Not conversations. I remember one specific Sunday lunch, maybe 6 months into our marriage, when Harriet was holding court about a cousin's wife who had never really fit in with the family. And the whole table was nodding along, and I sat there watching this casual verdict being delivered over pot roast and thought, she is showing me exactly what she does to women who don't comply. She wasn't talking about the cousin's wife. She was talking to me. She was telling me how these things end. And she was watching my face the whole time she said it, gauging whether I understood the warning. I understood it. I just decided not to let it land the way she intended. Because here is what Harriet had not fully accounted for. I spend my professional life reading people. I work with children who cannot always use words, and their parents who are exhausted and frightened and sometimes in denial. And you learn, doing that work, to hear what is being said underneath what is being said. I knew what Harriet was doing from nearly the beginning. I just didn't have the leverage to name it without sounding like a paranoid new wife. So I watched, and I remembered, and I kept my face pleasant. And I waited. So I managed Harriet. Carefully, thoroughly, the way you manage a weather condition rather than a person, not by fighting it, but by knowing which way it moves and planning accordingly. I was always pleasant. I never gave her the scene she was angling for, because a scene would have given her something to point to, a story to tell about the difficult daughter-in-law who couldn't take a little honest observation. I kept my reactions private, and my composure public, And when she said something that landed like a needle, I would smile and redirect the conversation, and then go home and sit with Eli's old dog, who has since passed, and talk it through with him, because dogs are excellent listeners and have no opinion on which daughter-in-law you should have chosen. I told myself that when we had children which we both wanted, something would shift. That when Harriet had a grandchild to focus on, the particular obsession she had with me would find a healthier outlet. That the love she had for Eli would extend, in time, to the family he was building. That a baby would be the thing that finally made her see us as a family worth claiming rather than a situation worth managing. I was so wrong about that. But I didn't know it yet. When I got pregnant our first try, which I know is lucky, and I don't take it for granted, I told Eli in the kitchen on a Tuesday night, and he cried. Happy tears, the silent kind that just fall, and held me for a long time, and it was one of the best moments of my life. We told Harriet 2 weeks later, in person, over a dinner I'd spent all afternoon making, because I wanted her to feel included and valued and like the grandmother of this child from the very start. She was pleased, visibly, genuinely pleased. She hugged Eli. She hugged me. She asked about due dates and whether we knew the sex yet. She seemed softer than I'd ever seen her, and I thought, here it is, the shift I'd hoped for. She loves this baby. She's going to let us in. What I didn't understand then, and wouldn't understand for another 1.5 years, was that the shift wasn't toward me. It was toward the baby. And those are very different things. Harriet didn't start caring about me. She started caring about the child I was carrying, but specifically because of what she believed that child represented. Blood, continuation, her line, her people, her son's legacy. She wanted a grandchild who was, in her word, theirs. And as my pregnancy progressed, as I got bigger and more real and more visibly central to the entire enterprise, I started to sense that the warmth wasn't actually directed at me at all. I was just the vessel. The baby was the point. Let me tell you what 8 months of that feels like, because I don't think people who haven't experienced it quite understand the particular exhaustion of being valued only instrumentally. Harriet showed up for every milestone, the anatomy scan, the baby shower she insisted on hosting, and then turned into an event that was about the Marchetti side of the family and barely mentioned mine, the nursery reveal. She was present and engaged and, to any outside observer, a devoted grandmother-to-be. But what I felt, underneath all of it, was the persistent low-grade sensation of not being seen. She was excited about what I was producing. She was not excited about me. When I was sick in the first trimester, she expressed sympathy in a tone that suggested she was mostly concerned about the baby. When my back went out at 7 months, she fussed over whether I was resting enough, and all the fussing was directed at the health of the pregnancy, not at me as a person in pain. I was a container. She needed to stay in good working order, and I was tired, by the end, in a way that had nothing to do with pregnancy, and everything to do with spending 9 months being cared for and simultaneously invisible. I started to see it in small ways, at first. She'd pat my belly without asking and address the baby directly, as if I weren't attached to it. She'd make comments about Eli's genes, his height, his coloring, the Marchetti nose, in ways that felt less like family pride and more like an inventory, as if she was pre-allocating the baby's features. She sent Eli a photo of himself as a newborn, with a note that said, "I can't wait to see you in this little one." And she sent me nothing. She started talking about our family in ways that drew a circle around herself. Eli, Joanna, and the baby, and left me just barely on the outside of it. I began to feel, as my pregnancy wore on, like I was a participant in something I was not quite a member of. And then the baby came, and he was perfect. And she said he didn't look like one of theirs. And something that had been a low simmer for 9 months cracked open. What followed those first weeks at home was a masterclass in subtle, sustained pressure that I am still, honestly, a little awed by in its consistency. Harriet visited constantly in those early weeks, which I had to allow. Because she was the grandmother. Because Eli wanted her there. Because refusing would have cost more than tolerating. And in every visit she'd find something. My son's eyes were a surprising color. His hair was coming in unexpectedly. He had an unusual shape to his ears. None of these observations were accusations, exactly. They were just noticings, delivered in a musing, almost sorrowful tone, like she was trying to solve a puzzle and couldn't quite get there. She wasn't saying I'd been unfaithful. She was just making it very clear that she found my son's appearance puzzling in a way that had a specific implication, and she was doing it so carefully that any attempt to object would have made me look paranoid. Eli, to his credit, shut it down once. One evening when she made one of her musing comments about how funny it was that the baby had none of our coloring, he said quietly, "Mom, he's ours. Please stop." And she looked wounded and said she was just making an observation. And the subject dropped. But it didn't end. It just went underground. She started saying it to other people instead. Eli's aunt, an old family friend, Joanna, who had the decency to come to me privately and say, "I don't know what my mother is doing, but I want you to know I don't share her concerns." Which was kind. And also told me that the campaign had wider reach than I'd understood. I watched my husband's confidence in his own family begin to corrode. That's the thing people don't talk about enough when this kind of sustained insinuation happens. It's not just the targeted person who suffers. Eli started becoming quieter, more watchful, a little distant in a way that broke my heart. Because I could see him fighting with himself, see him wanting to trust me completely, and also not quite being able to fully close the door his mother kept cracking open. He never said it to me directly. He was too decent for that. But I could feel the hairline fracture she was widening, very slowly, between us, and I knew that if I let it go long enough, she'd split us in two. So when she called me on a Thursday afternoon while Eli was at work, and the baby was napping, I remember it exactly. I was standing at the kitchen sink washing a bottle, and her name came up on my phone, and something in me went very steady, the way it does when you have been waiting for a thing to arrive, and now here it is, and she said, in that measured, careful voice, "Petra, I think for everyone's sake, for Eli's sake, it might be worth doing a paternity test. Just to settle this once, and for all I did something she did not expect." I said yes. I said yes immediately. Without anger, without tears, without a single dramatic moment. Without even a pause long enough to let her feel the weight of the ask. She'd been waiting, I think, for me to refuse. A refusal would have confirmed the implication only a guilty person, or a person with something to fear, would refuse. Instead, I said, "You know what, Harriet? I think that's a great idea. Let's get it done." Cheerfully, evenly. The way you'd agree to a reasonable administrative suggestion. I heard a brief, unmistakable silence on the other end of the line. Just a beat too long. And in that beat, I heard everything. The recalibration. The mild alarm of a person whose trap has just closed on air. We did the test through a reputable lab, the kind that produces results that are legally defensible. Not a mail order kit with a 2-week turnaround that you can argue about. A cheek swab from the baby. One from Eli, one from me. Standard paternity plus maternity confirmation. Because at that point, I genuinely wanted the full picture in front of us. everything documented. No corner of this left for anyone to question later. The results came back in 8 business days. They were, as I had known they would be, completely unambiguous. My son was Eli's. To a probability that leaves no scientific room for doubt, the percentage the lab reports in these cases is so close to 100 that the decimal places are almost ceremonial. He was also, as the maternity portion confirmed, mine. He was, as I had known since the moment I felt him move, entirely ours. I called Harriet. I read her the numbers. I was pleasant about it. I heard a very long silence, and I thought that would be the end of it. The test result would land, and Harriet would be ashamed, and she would apologize, and we'd find some new equilibrium. That's the story I'd told myself going in, that the test would close the question and we'd move on. That is not what happened. She said, very quietly, "Well, I suppose that settles it." And then she said, and I have turned this sentence over in my mind so many times, since though of course there are all kinds of ways a family comes together. And she hung up. There are all kinds of ways a family comes together. I sat with that sentence for a week. It was such an odd thing to say. Harriet was not a woman who trafficked in ambiguity. She was precise, purposeful, controlled. Everything she said meant something. She was the kind of woman who, when she said interesting, meant wrong. And when she said, I suppose that's one way to look at it, meant you are incorrect and I am tired of you. Every syllable she uttered was load-bearing, so those 8 words, said in a half-whisper at the exact moment the DINA results had obliterated her entire 2-year campaign against me, those 8 words were not a gracious concession. They were not relief or regret. They were the involuntary flinch of someone who had just been very nearly grazed by a bullet meant for someone else, and who had felt the air move past her face. There are all kinds of ways a family comes together. I wrote the sentence in my journal the night of that call. I underlined it. And then I wrote underneath it, what does she know about this that I don't? I started thinking about what I knew about Harriet's history, which, I realized, was less than I should have known after 4 years of marriage. She didn't talk about her past much. Eli's father, Donald, had died before I met Eli, and Harriet didn't discuss him often. I knew she'd grown up in Eastern Oregon, married Donald young, had Joanna, and then Eli. What I did not know, what no one had ever specifically told me, was the particular timing of things. When they'd married. When the children had been born. Whether Eli had been born to them, or whether there had been any gap in the story. I want to be precise about what I did next, because I did not do anything dramatic or confrontational or even particularly clever. I just started paying attention to things I'd never had reason to look at before. I talked to Joanna. Joanna is 7 years older than Eli, and she is a fundamentally honest person, which Harriet has always slightly resented about her. Joanna has her mother's sharp mind without her mother's fear, and she had always been warmer to me than Harriet, not conspicuously. Not in a way that created alliance against the family, but in the quiet way of someone who sees more clearly than she lets on, and makes small room for you at the table, even when others are pushing you toward the door. I had always liked her. I trusted her, as much as I trusted anyone in that family. I had her over for coffee on a weekday morning, a pretext about the baby's upcoming birthday, and I waited until we were settled and comfortable and she'd had half her cup. And then I said, as casually as I could manage, "Can I ask you something strange? When your parents got married, how long had they been together?" Joanna set down her mug. Got a look on her face, that I can only describe as careful in a very specific way, not defensive, not evasive, but the look of someone who has been waiting for a question like this for a long time and is now assessing whether this is actually the right moment to answer it. She said, "Why are you asking?" I said, "Something your mother said to me after the test results came back. She said there are all kinds of ways a family comes together. And I can't figure out what she meant by that. It's been sitting with me." Joanna was quiet for almost a full minute. The kind of quiet that has a lot happening inside it. And then she said, very carefully, "I've wondered for a long time if Eli knew." I asked, "Knew what?" She told me what she knew, which was incomplete and secondhand, assembled over years from things overheard and things half-explained. And one conversation with their father, Donald, when she was 19, and had stumbled onto something she couldn't quite interpret, and he'd given her a partial answer, and then immediately tried to walk it back. The shape of what she knew was this: Eli had not been born to Harriet and Donald. He had been adopted, as an infant, through a private arrangement, one of those quiet placements that happened more commonly decades ago. Arranged through a mutual contact, when a young woman in a very difficult situation, and a couple who desperately wanted another child, found each other outside the formal system. The whole thing had been handled in a matter of weeks, and then sealed off, and never spoken of again. Harriet had been unable to conceive a second child after Joanna. Donald had wanted a son. And Eli had arrived when he was 3 days old, and was named and folded into the family and raised in every way as theirs, and no one not Eli. Not apparently most of the extended family had ever been told. Harriet had taken the secret, and Donald had kept it with her, and they had between them decided that this was a truth their son did not need to have access to. His own history. And they had simply decided it wasn't his. I sat in my kitchen after Joanna left, and I thought about a woman who had spent 30+ years protecting the secret that her beloved son was not biologically hers, and who had then turned around and spent the better part of 2 years implying that her son's child might not be biologically his. The layers of it. The absolute, breathtaking audacity of it. Harriet, who had built her entire identity around bloodlines and family resemblance and our people, had raised a son who carried none of her blood, and not a single cell of it, and didn't know it. All those careful comments about the Marchetti, knows a nose that had no biological connection to her. All that inventory of Eli's features and coloring she had no genetic hand in whatsoever. All those carefully worded observations about my son not looking like one of theirs delivered by a woman whose own son was not, by her definition, one of theirs. She had stood in front of me for 4 years as the guardian of a bloodline she was not biologically part of, and demanded that I prove my child belonged to that line. And the entire time the ground under her feet was made of the same lie she was trying to pin on me. I have turned this over so many times since, trying to decide what I feel about it, and what I keep arriving at is this: the cruelty of what she did to me was not at its deepest level about me. It was about her. She had been carrying a secret about not belonging for 30 years, and she had armored herself against that secret by performing, loudly and constantly, the opposite of its certainty about blood, about lineage, about who was theirs and who wasn't. Every cruel comment she made about my son was the sound of that armor. She had turned her own hidden vulnerability into a weapon, and aimed it outward. And I had been the target because I was there, because I was new, because I was the one thing in her son's life she hadn't fully managed. She wasn't evil in a clean way. She was afraid in a messy one. And she had made me pay for it for years. I will not tell you that understanding this made it easier to forgive her. It made it easier to understand her, which is not the same thing at all, and which sometimes makes the anger worse before it makes it better. But here is where I had to make the decision that mattered most in this whole story, and it wasn't a legal decision or a strategic decision. It was a human one, and it was harder than I expected, because it required me to be honest about what I actually wanted to do versus what I knew was right. What I wanted to do, and I'll be transparent about this, because I think honesty about our worst impulses is more useful than pretending they don't exist, was hold this secret for a while. Let it sit in my hands, heavy and sharp, while I figured out the best way to deploy it. Harriet had used a secret against me for 2 years. There was a particular appeal to the idea of using her secret against her, to let her live, for a while, with the knowledge that I knew, that I could say it at any moment, that the power dynamic had inverted, and she was now the one waiting. I will admit that the part of me that had been carved at and questioned and made to feel like an intruder in my own family for 4 years found some satisfaction in imagining that. But Eli didn't know. My husband did not know he was adopted. And whatever satisfaction I might get from holding that card, it was not my card. It was his. His life, his history, his identity, held in secret by his family for 30+ years and now held by me. And the question in front of me was not, how do I use this information, but what does this person, my husband, the father of my child, deserve to know about his own life? The answer to that question was not complicated once I stopped thinking about what I wanted and started thinking about what was right. He deserved to know. Not because it was a weapon I could use against Harriet, not to blow up her control over our family, though that would happen. Because it was simply and fundamentally his. And it had been kept from him. And that was a wrong that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with who he was as a person, with the right to know his own story. Whatever I felt about Harriet, I was not going to become someone who managed another person's truth for strategic purposes. That was exactly what she had done. I was not going to be her. I told Eli on a Sunday evening after the baby was asleep. I had thought about this moment for several days, how to say it. How much to say at once, whether to have Joanna there or to do it alone. I decided alone, because it was private and enormous and I didn't want him to feel ambushed by an audience. I made tea, which felt useful, if not actually helpful. And I sat down across from him at the kitchen table, and I said, I have something hard to tell you, and I need you to let me get through the whole thing before you react, because there are parts that are going to hit you in different ways. He looked at me with those steady gray eyes and he said, okay. Just that. Okay, that is the man I married. I told him everything I knew, in the order I'd learned it. The sentence Harriet had said on the phone, the week I'd spent turning it over, the conversation with Joanna, and what Joanna had told me. I told him plainly and carefully and as kindly as I knew how, because whatever I felt about his mother, this was not about her, this was about him. This was his life and his history, and he deserved to receive it without my feelings layered on top of it. He was very still while I talked, the way water goes still right before it freezes. When I finished, he sat quietly for a moment, and then he picked up his phone and called Joanna, right there at the table, and I got up and went to check on the baby. And when I came back, he was still on the phone, and his face had changed, gone somewhere interior and unreachable in the way that happens when something has shifted underneath a person, not just on the surface. He talked to Joanna for a long time. Then he spent an hour with old photographs, reconstructing the timeline on his own, cross-referencing dates, doing the quiet math of a man realizing that the story of his own childhood has arithmetic he'd never been asked to check. Then he called an elderly aunt on his father's side, his father's sister, who picked up on the second ring, heard his first sentence, and said, "Oh, Eli, I'm so glad you finally know." She had been waiting for that call, apparently, for 30 years. Eli didn't cry that night. He went to the couch and sat with Biscuit for a very long time. And I brought him his tea and sat next to him and did not say anything. Because I have learned, in the years I have been his wife, that the thing he most needs when something is very big is not words, it's company. Someone sitting in the same room as the thing with him, not trying to fix it, just present. So I sat. And Biscuit put his large warm head on Eli's knee and sighed, which was honestly more eloquent than anything I could have managed. He called Harriet the next morning. I did not listen to the call. That was between them. I took the baby for a long walk, and Biscuit, and I walked until my legs were tired, and when I came back, Eli was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing, and he said, "She confirmed it." She didn't even try to deny it. He was so quiet when he said it. Not angry, which surprised me, something that looked more like grief, the particular grief of a person who has been given back something they didn't know was taken. The full conversation with Harriet happened over the following week, in multiple sessions, and that conversation belongs mostly to Eli, and I will not map all of it for you here. What I will tell you is the shape of what she offered, because it is both more and less than you might expect. She did not pretend the secret wasn't real. She wept, genuinely, I think, or at least as genuinely as Harriet is capable of weeping, which is with one eye always on the effect she is having. She said that she and Donald had made the decision together, very early, that Eli did not need to carry the weight of knowing that they had loved him completely and without qualification from the first hour, and that to them he had always been their son in every way that mattered, and that the paperwork was just paperwork. She said she had been afraid of what it would do to him to know, afraid that it would make him feel less loved, afraid of the questions she couldn't answer about where he'd come from. She said she'd been protecting him. Eli is a fair man, and he sat with this, and he acknowledged that she had loved him, because that has never been in question. Harriet's love for her son is, I believe, the one completely honest thing about her. But he also said to her, clearly and without raising his voice, that protection is not the same as ownership. That choosing to withhold the story of someone's own life is not protection, it is control, dressed in the language of love to make it easier to live with. That he was an adult man with a family, and that a truth this large, a truth about who he was and where he came from, belonged to him, and that she had taken it and kept it and spent 30 years deciding what he needed to know about his own existence. And then he asked her about me. He said, "Explain to me how a woman who has hidden the truth of her son's adoption for 3 decades then turns around and spends 2 years questioning the paternity of his child. Explain that to me." And Joanna, who was present for that conversation at Eli's request, told me later that the silence that followed that question was one of the longest she had ever witnessed. And then Harriet said, very quietly, "I think I was afraid." And she could not say more than that. There was no more than that, just the naked admission of a frightened woman who had spent her whole life managing a secret, and who had responded to anything that threatened to move near that secret by pushing outward, hard, at whatever was closest. I had been closest. My son had been closest. She had turned her fear into a weapon and aimed it at us. Not because she believed what she was implying, I don't think she really did, but because fear, when it has nowhere to go, tends to attack the nearest thing. Here is what I understand now about Harriet's particular cruelty, and I offer it not as an excuse for her, but as a way of making sense of something that otherwise seems like pure contradiction. Harriet had spent decades managing a secret about her family not being what people thought it was. And I think somewhere in the part of herself she never examined. She had built the bloodline obsession as a kind of armor, a way of performing certainty about family and biology and ours that protected her from the anxiety of the secret she was keeping. The louder she was about whose blood was whose, the safer she felt. And when our son arrived and didn't look the way she'd expected, the armor went up automatically. Because that is what that armor did. She wasn't thinking, rationally, I had better investigate this baby's paternity. She was reacting, from the scared place she'd lived in for 30 years to anything that felt like it might unsettle the story. She turned her fear outward, at me, at my baby, because that is what unexamined fear does. It finds a target. This does not make what she did acceptable. It makes it explicable, which is a different thing, and a less satisfying one, but in my experience, the only kind of understanding that actually holds. What changed afterward was not everything. I want to be honest about that, because I think we are sometimes tempted, when we tell stories like this, to wrap them up too neatly, to imply that the confrontation solved everything and everyone became their better selves and Sunday dinners are now warm and uncomplicated. That is not my life. Harriet and I did not become close. The trust between us is not something I expect to fully repair in my lifetime, and I have made a kind of peace with that, the acceptance, not of the wrong she did, but of the reality that some damage, once done, remains in the structure of a relationship the way a crack remains in a wall you've replastered. You can cover it. It doesn't go away. But here is what did change, and it matters. The power did. The dynamic of that room, our kitchen, our Sunday dinners, our Christmas mornings, the way we navigate who leads and who follows has shifted in a way that is permanent and, I believe, unrecoverable for her. She no longer sets the tone. She is not the authority she was. The invisible hierarchy in which Eli had spent his whole life, the one where Harriet's approval was quietly the weather everything else had to survive in that hierarchy, ended. Because Eli had to look at his own mother clearly, perhaps for the first time, and decide who he was in relation to her now that the story she'd told him about himself had been revised. And what he decided is that he is a grown man with a wife and a son and a life he has built, and that his mother is someone he loves and will take care of, and will absolutely not be managed by anymore. That correction did not require a scene. It did not require an ultimatum. It just required the truth to be said out loud by the person she had spent 30 years most carefully managing without flinching. She loves my son. I believe that. Now, more than I did in the worst of it. She loved him before she knew what the test would say, which is either the one saving grace of the whole situation, or simply proof that love and fairness can coexist in a person with a monstrous amount of hypocrisy. And I've concluded, over time, that it's probably both, and that holding both of those things at once is just what it looks like to see a complicated person clearly. She shows up for him. She is, in the actual room with the actual child, a different version of herself than the version I've described, warmer, less managed, more genuinely present. Babies have a way of getting past armor that nothing else can get past. My son has no idea what she did, and he accepts her lap and her attention without the wariness that, honestly, I still sometimes feel watching her. I have decided to let that be enough, for now, for his sake, for Eli's, and partly because I have spent enough of my finite energy on Harriet already. And I know now, better than I did, that the cost of keeping someone at the center of your anger is paid entirely by you. Eli is still working through what he learned about his origins. He has started looking, carefully and on his own schedule, at what records exist the original adoption paperwork, which Mr. Calloway no, that's a different story. The attorney Harriet had used, who Joanna helped us locate, what the records contain, and what they don't. Whether his biological parents are living, or findable, or looking. He takes this at his own pace, and I follow his lead entirely. Because this is not my excavation to run. It belongs to him. I sit with him when he wants company, and I leave the room when he needs to be alone with it. And I watch my husband quietly, methodically assemble a more complete picture of himself. And I find that I am simultaneously proud of him, and heartbroken for him, and fiercely glad that he gets to do this, that he gets to know, that this choice is now his, that no one is managing what he has access to anymore. It cost something to get here. I think the cost was worth it. I believe he does too. My son, for his part, is 14 months old and has no idea that any of this happened, and he is absolutely relentlessly delightful, and he has just learned the word dog and applies it to everything biscuit, cars, the ceiling fan, Harriet, and watching him boss around the world with that single joyful word is the best thing in my life. He looks like himself. He looks like nobody else. He is not a container for anyone's bloodline. He is a person, new and entire and impossible to anticipate, and he is mine, and he is Eli's, and whatever else may be true about this family, that is the part that is permanent. So here is what I learned, and what I'll leave with you. Blood is the language people use when what they actually mean is belonging. And belonging is something that can be performed as gatekeeping or offered as welcome, and the difference between those two things matters enormously to the people being kept out, yes. But also, I've come to think, to the people doing the keeping, because the gatekeepers are almost never as secure as they appear. The people who wave bloodlines like a banner, who make other people prove themselves by biology, who question whether children look right or carry the right features, those people are very often doing it because they themselves are uncertain about where they belong, because they are afraid of what they've hidden, because the certainty they perform is covering for a doubt they can't afford to examine. In my professional life, I work with parents who manage their anxiety about their children's differences by controlling every variable they can reach. And I have learned that the most controlling behavior is almost never about the target. It is almost always about the person performing the control and what they cannot face in themselves. Harriet was not the guardian of a family line. She was a frightened woman with a decades-old secret, defending walls she'd built to protect herself from a truth she couldn't say out loud, aiming her fear at the nearest available target. For 4 years, that was me. Here is what I find remarkable in retrospect, and what I think is worth sitting with. She asked for the test. She engineered the test. She was so certain she was about to catch me in the lie she'd been implying for 2 years that she called me on a Thursday afternoon and proposed it as if she were doing me a favor. And the test came back, and it told her nothing she wanted to hear, and it handed me exactly the thread I needed to pull. And when I pulled it, the secret that unraveled was not mine. It was hers. 30 years of a hidden truth, protected at the cost of her son's ability to know himself, came apart because of a trap she had set for me. That is not something I engineered. I just had the sense to notice that the door had opened, and to walk through it. If someone is holding blood over your head, questioning your place in a family, questioning your children's right to be there, making you prove a belonging you have already earned through presence and love and years of showing up, I want you to look carefully at them. Not just at the weapon they're pointing, but at the whole picture. Because very often the people who are most loudly certain about who belongs and who doesn't are the ones most afraid of what their own story actually says. They are performing certainty they do not feel. And certainty that needs to be performed, that loudly, is usually covering something. Real families are not made by biology alone. They are made by presence and honesty and the willingness to know each other, truly including the parts that are hard to say out loud. The parts we'd rather bury. The parts that don't fit the story we've built about who we are and where we came from. My mother-in-law built a family in secret and then spent 30 years policing biology. My husband was raised by people who loved him and lied to him. My son is being raised by people who love him and will tell him the truth, always, about everything, because I have seen what the alternative costs. He is not a container for anyone's legacy. He is a beginning. And that, to me, is more than enough. If this story reached something in you, if someone has ever questioned where you belong in your own family, share it with someone who needs to hear that belonging is not in the blood test. Drop a comment and tell me your story. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.